Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, we interview 20-year-old organizer Calla Walsh to talk about her experiences as a co-founder of Palestine Action US, as well as the political repression she and others have faced in the case of the Merrimack 4. She talks about why we should view their case as a win and underlines the need for continued escalation for Palestine 13 months into the genocidal response to Al-Aqsa Flood. In this interview, she offers in-depth discussion of the importance of risk-taking and the problems of defeatist narratives around taking direct action. It is also a sober set of reflections, criticisms, and self-criticism about the last year in the Palestine solidarity movement in the U.S. There are also reflections on the lack of strong ethics around movement defense in this time and principles of basic solidarity towards those facing repression, even if there may be legitimate criticisms people have of their actions. Calla also offers an analysis of some of the distinctions between Palestine Action UK and Palestine Action US, and how Calla thinks we should reorient approaches to direct action for Palestine in the US given these differences. It is important to note that Palestine Action UK continues to face a lot of repression and continues to have significant successes as well in the UK. We have a recent discussion with Huda Amori, which we encourage you all to listen to in order to learn more about that and see ways you can support Palestine Action in the UK. I really encourage people who listen to this discussion to write to Calla and other members of the Merrimack 4 while they are in jail. All of their contact information is in the show description. And if you like what we do, please become a patron of the show. You can do so for as little as $1 a month, and we can only do what we do with the support of our listeners. We have an upcoming study group on George Jackson's Blood in My Eye, which will be starting up soon. Information on that will be available in the next week. But if you want to make sure you don't miss that opportunity, the best place to keep tabs on that and all of our other work is by becoming a patron at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. All right, so we're recording this on November 1st of 2024. I'm just noting that for our audience because it is a kind of discussion that probably, the time and the orientation, everything that we talk about related to Palestine and so on, when it is recorded matters to some extent because we're often talking about events that are changing constantly. So I'm here with Calla Walsh, and one of the things we wanted to talk about was Palestine Action US and her involvement with that organization or group. And just for context, we hosted an interview all the way back a year ago now, a little over a year ago, on October 23rd of 2023, which I think is important too, and also that you all came together like right after, October 7th, very soon, didn't take long to respond with the work that you all wanted to do. So obviously, Palestine Action US came out of a longer organizing tradition of Palestine Action, which is UK-based, and we've had a couple of conversations over the year with Huda Amori, one of the co-founders of that organization. And I just want to shout out them. They've continued to make an impact, and they just recently, Barclays just divested from Elbit, and there was another, like a lobbying firm that also had cut ties with Elbit in recent days. And so, just shout out to them for continuing to, have an impact on Elbit systems, for one, which is one of their primary targets. And of course, to you all for taking direct action. And I know that there was a facility in Cambridge from Elbit that is now shut down as well as a result of the protests and things like that you all have done there. So, and of course, part of what we'll talk about, of course, is repression, because obviously they face repression and continue to face repression, and solidarity to all of them. And you all have faced repression as well. So anyway, I don't want to, I'll let you kind of direct where you want to start this conversation. But I know we want to talk a little bit about this sort of year of history of Palestine Action US. So start us wherever you would like.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I've been listening to the show since I was like 16, and I've always wanted to chat more with y'all. So I'm really excited. I guess we should start with Pal Action UK, which launched in 2020 and has been doing this for several years since the genocide has always been ongoing, and did not start on October 7th, obviously. Pal Action UK has done hundreds, if not thousands, of actions. I don't claim to be an expert on their history. I've never been to the so-called United Kingdom. But I will say PAL Action UK combined a lot of different tactics, from more like civil disobedience style intentional arrests to actions like ours in New Hampshire, occupying roofs of weapons companies, causing property damage, trying to shut down permanently these facilities. Also branching into actions like clandestine sabotage, where no one gets arrested, and the secondary and tertiary targeting of investors and real estate collaborators with Elbit. We've seen most recently yesterday that Barclays divested from Elbit. And just today they announced, I think, an insurance company that's cutting off their relationship with Elbit, and they've permanently shut down several facilities. So huge shout out to PAL Action UK for doing this work for several years. Right now they have over 10 political prisoners, some in England, some in Scotland, some serving sentences for charges they've been convicted for, some being held on trial under terrorism charges, including a girl my age who just turned 21 in prison, who's being held until next November, I believe, until their trial for dismantling an Elbit facility. So PAL Action US launched seeing the need also to target the weapons companies in our backyards after October 7th. And the first action that really kicked off PAL Action US was on October 12th at the Cambridge, Massachusetts so-called Innovation Center for Elbit. And to give a little more local background, I grew up in Cambridge my entire life, a few blocks away from where this Elbit is. And as soon as it opened in December 2021, local anti-Zionist organizations started organizing around it, particularly BDS Boston. I think it's really notable that an independent Palestine organization like BDS Boston had been built up in the greater Boston area well before October 7th. That wasn't really beholden to some of these national NGOs or to like groups like DSA. They always made their independent, very principled anti-Zionist line very clear. And this is an organization that was also condemned by the BDS National Committee for their support of the mapping project, which BDS Boston did not create the mapping project. I did not create the mapping project, although a lot of Zionist think tanks have alleged that I did. But the point is they were condemned by some of these more like counterinsurgent, reformist, you could say normalizer or liberal Zionist groups for supporting this project, and drew a really clear line of demarcation in the movement and really chose the radical path. And so after October 7th, I happened to be coming back home for Boston. I was living in DC at the time. I happened to be coming home to Boston for a Cuba Solidarity conference I was organizing right after October 7th. And it was so clear the need to escalate. I mean, I was seeing the most horrifying things I'd ever seen in my life. There was a need to escalate before October 7th, certainly, but suddenly tens, hundreds of thousands more people were aware. And really, we have a duty to shut down the facilities that are producing these weapons in our backyards that are being sent to bomb Gaza, particularly Elbit, which already has this 4-year-long international campaign targeting it that successfully shut down several. So the first action on October 12th, I guess I'll talk about that a little more later on, since I did get some charges for that action. But PAL Action US didn't form at that point. It was just like, we're doing this action, seeing how people receive it. And it was very well received. People clearly saw the need for escalation. And so PAL Action US was launched. And I guess let me talk a little bit more about the strategy in Cambridge that was used to shut down the Elbit there. I think Cambridge is a place that's like the heart of the military academic industrial complex. There's so many weapons companies. There's so many universities that are funded by the DoD and have partnerships with these genocide profiteers. And the combination of these clandestine direct action property damage tactics with above ground widespread community organizing and secondary and tertiary targeting was really key to shutting down the facility. So there was like a month and a half where there was consistent direct actions at the Elbit causing property damage, but there was also a lot of community organizing around it that continued even after some of these more militant direct actions stopped. That included home demonstrations against Elbit's landlord, who, it should be noted, was Armenian, and Elbit weapons are being used to murder and commit genocide against Armenians. And the person renting to Elbit was an Armenian community member. There were weekly demos outside the Elbit. There was also phone banking of the landlord, of the real estate company, of every single other tenant in that building, since Elbit just occupied the second floor office of that building and there are many other companies in it. And the phone banking was really effective because we were saying we're not going to stop calling you until you tell your landlord to evict this genocide profiteer. And so it really, all those helped build pressure to ultimately evict Elbit. But well before we got official confirmation that Elbit was losing their lease and being kicked out, they'd already pushed all their employees to be working remotely because they didn't feel like coming into work anymore when there were constantly protesters outside.
Yeah, so you were charged for alleged participation in 3 different actions. And yeah, it'd be interesting, I'm sure, for our audience to hear your, what you can share from those stories.
Yeah, so let's start with the first action on October 12th. On that morning, 3 people, including allegedly me, locked our necks to the front entrance of the Elbit building with bicycle locks and effectively shut down business for the day. There was a big rally of supporters that showed up after they found out we were blockading the Elbit, and they rallied across the street from us. Allegedly, the building and the sidewalk in front of the building was also defaced with red paint. And the lockdown was held down for a few hours. A ton of cops showed up. A fire truck showed up to cut the people locked down out. And they were kind of like just dilly-daddling. And the people locked down realized we shouldn't just get arrested for like sitting here. We've already shut down the facility for a day. So they escaped without arrest. The police were not paying attention and were very befuddled. But later, using social media footage, I was identified for allegedly defacing the building and received 2 felony vandalism charges in the mail a couple weeks later for that case. And I will also say a few months later, some people did some public records requests to the Cambridge city government about anything related to Palestine, anything related to Elbit, because the city government in Cambridge was clearly like complicit in the repression of anti-Zionist protests and also covering up murals in public spaces that were perfectly legal, covering them up because they said globalize the Intifada, and they alleged that was anti-Semitic. And these public records requests revealed that a lot of local real estate interests, gentrifiers, Zionists in Cambridge, specifically in Central Square in Cambridge, which is rapidly being gentrified by these private interests, they were emailing the city government essentially threatening to hire their own private armed security vigilantes to protect their buildings if the city government did not identify and arrest us. And so that led to me getting those charges. And I mean, hopefully those emails will all be published somewhere someday, since they're really revealing about this web of Zionist interests that are also contributing to the genocide and basically like ethnic cleansing of homeless populations in this neighborhood. So then later, the Cambridge Elbit continued to be targeted throughout that entire following month. And on October 30th, there was another action, a mass action at the Elbit facility. And it was called in response to the Cambridge police putting up what was essentially a border wall around an entire 2 blocks of where the Elbit building was. It's a very big building. It's in a busy intersection in Central Square. They surrounded the entire thing with barricades because there'd been repeated direct actions and property damage there. It was completely ridiculous. And a mass rally was called in response to that. That was on the morning of October 30th. There were dozens and dozens of cops there. A big crowd showed up, occupied the intersection for an hour or 2. And the rally escalated when protesters started trying to push back against the barricades that the police had set up, trying to get to the building. Because essentially there was like a wall of pigs and their metal barricades standing there protecting this genocide profiteering company. And it very quickly escalated into what could be called a mini riot, where the cops were just running into the crowd, tackling people, shoving them to the ground, pepper spraying people. And I will say that the Cambridge Police Department really prides itself in being one of the most like progressive police departments in the country. Cambridge prides itself on being one of the most progressive cities in the country. Outside City Hall, there's like sidewalks painted with the trans flag, and there's murals to like Trayvon Martin and Breonna Taylor, which is really disgusting when you consider that Cambridge is actively covering up a police murder that happened in January 2023. It's very, very hypocritical and insidious liberal counterinsurgency. And the police were absolutely overwhelmed and terrified because they're not used to this happening in Cambridge. They weren't expecting this powerful collective resistance from the crowd who was de-arresting people, who was resisting the police, throwing projectiles, etc. And there were several successful de-arrests, but 9 of us were ultimately arrested that day and faced various charges from disorderly conduct to felony vandalism to much more serious charges like assault and battery on a cop and resisting arrest. But at this point, 7 people's charges have been dropped, and the only people still facing charges are me and one other person who was arrested in both Cambridge and in New Hampshire. And in that case, I'm facing 3 felony vandalism charges and a disorderly conduct charge. One of the charges is for allegedly throwing an egg at the Elbit building. And like one of our last court dates, the judge spent 20 minutes deliberating like the nature of eggs and whether eggs qualify as vandalism and whether if you throw an egg at a building and it doesn't crack, but you have the intent to vandalize it, whether that still counts as vandalism. So clearly these charges are being dragged out for way longer than they ever should have been. And I think it's really notable that New Hampshire, a Republican state, has dropped our charges down to misdemeanors, and Massachusetts, this liberal haven, where the facility was actually permanently shut down, is still holding these felonies against us. And I don't have another court date there until January, when I will already be out of jail in New Hampshire and on probation for that case.
You've talked about sort of multiple felony charges related to Cambridge. I mean, what kind of prison time would that? Maybe more about what you feel, what you're facing there, or what you think the legal process there, I guess.
Yeah, prison and jail time aren't on the table and haven't been in Massachusetts, despite them being more extreme charges. It's more so not wanting felonies on my record. That's why we're fighting those charges.
Yeah, understandable. Yeah. Well, I guess that's good, at least in terms of the time. But yeah, that's crazy in terms of felony charges for things like egging and stuff like that. Yeah. Well, let's talk more about that. Like, so, you've described the charges that you faced, that others have faced. I guess, broadly speaking, how has the legal process impacted Palestine Action, but just more broadly, the type of organizing? And yeah, do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly after these first 2 dates I was facing charges for in October 2023, I did not stop doing action or taking risk. And some people would probably say that was really stupid and unstrategic, but no regrets that I kept taking action. And so I guess before I can explain how this legal process has played out, I should explain the action that we faced the most extreme charges for in Merrimack, New Hampshire, which was on November 20th, when there was essentially a tri-pronged, what the state has characterized as a riot and siege on the Elbit facility in Merrimack, New Hampshire. A group of people blockaded the driveway to the facility, preventing employees from entering, while at the same time, 3 of us allegedly scaled the roof and occupied the roof of the building, allegedly caused property damage on top of the roof, and at the same time, a group of people entered and attacked the front face of the building, defacing the front entrance, and then escaping and retreating through the woods. And so the only people first arrested for that action were the 3 of us on the roof. We were up there for a pretty short amount of time before police came up and arrested us at gunpoint, which was very scary. We were taken into custody. All our belongings were seized. We were threatened that we were going to be interrogated by the FBI and by DHS and by New Hampshire counterterrorism. None of that ever happened. It was definitely a fear-mongering tactic to try to get one of us to talk. And we were told our charges. I really didn't know what the charges meant at the time when they were read off to me in the police station. And then we were booked into jail overnight. We were being held on preventative detention and waiting for our arraignment the following day, Tuesday. So we were held overnight and then brought to the Hillsborough County Courthouse for our arraignment. And at that point, the three of us were separated and each given a public defender who explained the charges to us individually. And that was when I realized how serious it was, because the public defender said that I was facing 37 years in prison, that they were arguing to hold us on preventative detention since we'd already been out on bail in Cambridge, and that we likely would not get bail and would be held through trial and then in prison for the rest of our lives. And then we were all permanently separated because as part of our arraignment, we were given no contact orders, all the co-defendants. So we were arraigned one by one. I was brought up to the courtroom in my orange jumpsuit and shackles, and the prosecutor argued that basically, in using lines that had looked like they'd been taken directly from my Canary Mission page, argued that I was like running around the country, committing crimes. I'd also been arrested in DC earlier that year for a protest in Bob Menendez's office about Cuba. And all those charges were dropped. It was super minor, but they were even using that against me. They were reading off quotes from my Twitter where I'd called cops pigs, arguing that I was anti-Semitic, that I had participated in the mapping project. But thankfully, the public defender was able to argue down my bail and get me $20,000 cash bail. Bail in New Hampshire is only cash, unlike most other states. And when I walked into the courtroom, I also saw like my mom was there. Some of my comrades were there. That's when I also realized how serious it was, because I never really wanted my parents to have to get caught up in the legal risks I was taking. But it's really good that my mom was there. And I'll never forget, like when I was being taken back into custody, she tried to get up and hug me and realized she couldn't. But that was very moving. And then we were taken back to jail. We were all separated. And I was held until the following night. So I got out the Wednesday night right before Thanksgiving. And yeah, we were all released with these bail conditions, obviously not getting arrested again, staying away from all Elbit facilities and all Elbit employees, and the no contact order. And the next day after I got out was so-called Thanksgiving. I went to the National Day of Mourning with my mom, and also my lawyer was there. My lawyer's really cool. He's my bestie. And I remember, I couldn't believe I got out, since I had really thought for a period of time that I would be in there forever. My mom had to come with $40,000 cash in her pocket to New Hampshire, and she's like 5'1", and bail us out in the dark of night. And yeah, I was just so grateful I got out, but certainly I knew it changed everything, and I couldn't be organizing in the same way as I had before. And so to get into really like the legal process and how we dealt with facing this extreme level of repression, not only the 37 years in prison charges, but also the threats of federal investigation. Since the day we were arrested, it was declared that the FBI was assisting with this investigation. And I will say, like, Palestine Action was never an organization. It was never a formal thing that anyone had membership in. But I will say the sense of urgency that we were operating with in the immediate aftermath of the Al-Aqsa Flood, seeing the urgency to escalate in the face of the escalating genocide, we moved with such urgency that we didn't take time to really build infrastructure that could withstand state repression. And I think the proximity to huge amounts of resources also contributed to that, the kind of bypassing the steps of building legitimacy, building community support. And so Pal Action, as it had been operating before, effectively ceased to exist when most of the co-founders were either taken out by extreme charges or left the country in fear of the same charges. The no contact order was also one of the key counterinsurgency tactics used by the state that was really used to thwart our ability to have an effective joint defense, to politicize our case publicly, and just to fracture our social networks by making it impossible for many of us to talk to each other. And I think this was felt the most intensely when my comrade Paige was arrested, because a lot of people don't know the Merrimack 3 originally is now the Merrimack 4. A fourth person was arrested 2 months after the rest of us when she was walking into the courthouse to support me and the other co-defendants at a hearing that we had on January 24th. And this is my comrade Paige Belanger. And she walked into the courthouse. I was already in the courtroom waiting. She texted me like 10 minutes before that she was about to be there. and she never showed up. And we found out later that when she showed up, there were Merrimack police waiting with a picture printed out of her face, waiting to arrest her, alleging that she had been part of the same action. And so an hour later, after this hearing that Paige had never showed up to, she called us from jail and we got her bailed out the next day. But she was also being held on preventative detention, and they attempted to give her the same bail as us. They attempted to give her $20,000 bail, even though she'd never been arrested before. And all the public defenders had already represented the rest of us or had conflicts of interest. And so she didn't even have a lawyer to represent her at her arraignment. She had to represent herself and successfully argued down her bail from $20,000 to $5,000. And the Massachusetts bail fund bailed her out. But then after that, we had a no contact order, and Paige and I had been living together, and she'd really been like the core of my support system. And so it was absolutely terrible to be isolated from my best friend and to not be able to go through this together. And thank God the no contact order was dropped at the end of May. Our lawyers won their motion to get it dropped, because I don't know what I'd be doing right now, counting down the days to go to jail, if I couldn't be like sharing that weight on my shoulders with someone else and going through this together. And I will also say, like, the no contact orders are a tactic that's been used against a lot of defendants in the Stop Cop City movement. Typically, they're only used when there's a threat of violence or witness intimidation, which obviously there wasn't in our case, nor is there in the Defend the Atlanta Forest cases. But the goal is to like fracture these social networks, these political networks. And in Atlanta, they were really vague in terms of prohibiting defendants from associating with anyone who's part of the so-called Defend the Atlanta Forest movement, which is not like an solid, clear membership-based movement. It's more nebulous. Other things that are notable about our legal process, I mean, we were facing really extreme charges. We were facing misdemeanor criminal trespass, felony conspiracy to commit criminal mischief, felony riot, felony burglary, felony sabotage, and felony conspiracy to falsify physical evidence. Those were all the charges. And the first charge to be dropped was this sabotage charge, which is really interesting, and I think also shows some of the incompetence of the legal system, because this charge no one had ever been charged with before in the state of New Hampshire. It was written in the 70s, I'm guessing because of the Vietnam War, and the statute was about punishing anyone who attempted to hinder the U.S. or its allies' defense capacity. And we were charged with that, and it had a minimum 1 year in prison, Class A felony. It was the most extreme charge. But the prosecutors realized that statute was only applicable during a declared state of emergency, which there was not. So they had to drop it. And that was our first win. Our next win in our legal case, the small win of getting the no contact orders dropped, was another good sign. And another small win we had was that my phone had been seized, and the New Hampshire Attorney General's in May, June, filed a motion to search my phone. And my lawyer won the motion to deny that search because of their unreasonable seizure and delay. And so they never got to search my phone. So that was another small win. And yeah, then we were essentially in negotiations about a plea deal. And we all had different lawyers who were working together on kind of a joint defense. And we ended up having criminal mediation on September 18th. And that's how we got to this deal that we have now, that we're about to be sentenced for on November 14th. And from that sentencing hearing, we'll be taken into custody. And we're just pleading to 2 misdemeanors and serving a 60-day jail sentence. And then we have some community service and probation and a suspended sentence. But really, I think this outcome should be celebrated as a win against the repression, going from 37 years to 60 days, going from 5 felonies to misdemeanors. Obviously, it's not good for anyone to have charges on their record or for anyone to go to jail. But I think showing that we can defeat the most extreme state repression is a really good example to set. And I think showing people can go to jail and survive that experience and come out stronger is also really important to show the movement. I'll say the entire process for a while was really isolating. I think our action has become understood the longer the genocide has gone on and escalated, and the longer the movement in the US has developed in its tactics and more people have gotten arrested and more people have taken militant action, our action has been better understood. But at first it was very taboo. No one was really doing anything like this in the US at all. And I got out of jail after 3 days of no communication with anyone. And I saw like tens of thousands of people on Twitter saying that we'd firebombed a small Jewish mom and pop shop. And it was very extreme, this like chilling effect that the charges we were facing had in the movement, not just from like the right-wing press that was saying these crazy things, but including from people within the movement who just want to do like peace policed mass rallies and were very averse to these direct action escalatory tactics and had been actively, trying to get us to stop doing them before. And I think for a while I felt very like infectious, or I felt like any space I was in, I'd be endangering people, or people were scared to interact with me because of the charges I was facing. And I actually think that's the most dangerous possible response to have to facing repression, is isolating yourself, marginalizing yourself, silencing yourself. That's exactly what the state wants you to do. I think the lessons that we've learned through our case is largely that repression can and will be defeated. And the most important thing to do before it's defeated, while you're still in the moments where it all could be real, you could be going to prison for 37 years, it's to keep your head up. It's to not let it crush your spirit, to stay principled, to stay in the movement. And yeah, I think we're seeing that a similar dynamic right now with the Samidoun Political Prisoner Solidarity Network to a much more extreme degree, because they were designated by Canada as a terrorist organization and by OFAC in the US as a specially designated organization. And we're very much seeing the chilling effect that is having in the movement. I mean, many organizations were silent for weeks about Samidoun's designation out of fear of saying anything. And the state knows very, very well. They certainly have the intelligence to know that Samidoun is not fundraising for any designated groups, any resistance groups in Palestine. They know that no one in Samidoun is a member of any of those designated groups. If that were true, they'd be in prison. So the point is that this designation is bogus, but the effect is this ripple, this chilling effect it's having, targeting and isolating groups that are vocally defending and upholding the resistance. And I think we experienced similar dynamics after our arrest and some of the lack of vocal support or solidarity that we received from the broader movement after we engaged in those tactics. And I will say Samidoun and Charlotte Cates is an incredible person who saw this happening and supported us immediately after our arrests. And that's why I feel like it's so important for everyone to be defending as loudly as possible Samidoun right now and speaking out against this bogus designation. I will also say I think there's a lot of genuine critiques of our actions and the early phase of PAL Action US that I share myself, and I think we'll get into those later on. I think it was hard to receive those at first. I don't think when people are locked up is the best time and place to make those critiques with no context at all about what happened during our action. A lot of people making their critiques based off what the police report said, based off what right-wing media was saying. I think largely people still have no idea what actually happened with our action. And so that's why I'm happy to finally have a chance to explain it. But it was hard to parse out the genuine critiques from the bad faith critiques. And I do think some of the ways we engaged in militancy, certainly promoting an intentional arrest tactic, which I now disagree with myself, I see why organizations didn't leap to support us in the same way. But yeah, let's get into talking more about counterinsurgency, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that you just said, Calla, and thank you genuinely for sharing all of those reflections as well as like the personal impact of this. And I remember those critiques when they came out, and I was, I mean, even in self-criticism and self-reflection, typically millennials doesn't issue a lot of statements and things like that. But I wish we probably had even done more to say that, Yeah, I mean, we absolutely, I mean, one, I don't think that, I agree with you. I don't think that's the time for even principled criticism is right in the midst of something like that happening and the kind of repression you're facing. Two, I think it's kind of bullshit for people to be able to sort of say that they could predict exactly how the state of New Hampshire would have responded to that action. I don't think that that's, I mean, maybe they should, whatever. And we can talk about that. I know we'll get more into discussions of intentional arrests and things like that. And yeah, I mean, I have my own feelings about doing actions where people are intentionally being arrested. But I think, I mean, there's so many threads that you touched on that I want to touch on. I mean, one, yes, I mean, solidarity to you and to Palestine Action US and the people that took that action, solidarity to Sammy Doon, so many other folks. I mean, we've been trying to have some discussions where we talk about the impact of repression. We had one just earlier this week with Lara Shihai where we talked about it, at the psychological impacts of repression. And you're talking about it as a recipient of that, and that has a particular psychological impact on you, which I think is part of what you're expressing. But it also has this, as you said, the chilling effect. It also has a psychological impact on other people within the movement. And I think also that isolation or that refusal, or that, it's not even a refusal, it's this inability, I think, to show up. I mean, for some people, yes, some people are making a kind of opportunistic, I would say, dismissal of what you all are doing, whether because maybe they don't agree with it tactically, maybe they aren't willing to do it personally. They're not willing to, grapple with the sacrifices that are necessary for that type of action. I mean, any number of reasons, but, like there's probably an opportunism on one level, I think, that some people might have that might be based on their read of conditions, right? Of just saying, like, we're not going to do this as an organization because we don't think that we can sort of withstand it. I think that sometimes that's very hard to tell the difference. It's not something that we can necessarily see from the outside with organizations, I think, of, are they responding this way out of an analysis, or are they responding this way out of fear, ultimately? And I mean, that because that requires us to get inside their heads in a way that we can't ultimately. But I think either way, the impact of that non-response, or those, the non-response is one form, the dismissal or disavowal is another form. The impact of those actions is, I think, incredibly detrimental. I mean, and this was, if I had any reflection upon that action, yeah, I mean, the biggest problem, I think, in my mind was that the way that sort of action, in certain ways, like for a lot of people, I felt like took the kind of militancy that you all were embracing and the direct action, right? Because I think direct action is like one of our most powerful tools, that it became something that people weren't even discussing in certain ways, And that's, I want to say very clearly, like, I don't think that's the fault of Palestine Action US in any way. I think that speaks much more to, again, like this difficulty that people have, and an internalization of, kind of nonviolent civil disobedience. I mean, people are more comfortable with the kind of arrest theater, as I describe it, like a kind of nonprofit arrests, planned arrests, where what the charges are going to be, sort of scenario that we have in the United States often now, where the charges are basically agreed to between the organization and the police. People are more comfortable with that than they are with people taking action that requires risk and self-sacrifice, where you don't know fully what the consequences of it will be. And that in itself is a huge problem that we have to figure out how we're going to overcome. And I don't necessarily have the solution to that. But yeah, I mean, I just wanted to respond to what you had just said in that way. And there's more I want to respond to too, because I kind of want to get back into some of that legal element to some degree. But yeah, go ahead if you want to say something in response to that.
Yeah, thanks for all that. It was just making me think of more things I want to add on. I mean, I agree with everything. You said, I think what was so defeatist about the response to our action is that I got out and people, including people who were claiming to be my friends, who I knew in real life, were just readily accepting that we would spend the rest of our lives in prison rather than understanding that when actions take place that the state is scared of, they tend to do this. They tend to throw really extreme charges that will never stick out in the end, that are worth battling. And yeah, I think it was a very defeatist perspective that failed us when we were in that moment of facing these extreme charges. And I will say there were also a lot of very misogynist narratives that tried to take away our agency and wanted to make the action that we took seem completely illogical and insane and something people would only do if they were groomed into a cult. And we completely reject that. I think it's really notable that queer people and women are at the forefront of a lot of direct actions and on the front lines in a lot of cities in this country. And yeah, that was one of the hardest things to combat, was upholding the righteousness of these actions. While I couldn't really say anything about the action in the immediate aftermath, I never really silenced myself. I mean, I tweet about how much I love Hamas every day, but for a long, long time, I couldn't tweet about the action at all. And I couldn't defend my own agency in taking the actions that I did. But you're absolutely right in portraying this as psychological warfare. I think over a year now, we've been in this physical state of fight or flight because of the repression. And you're going through that. You actually learn really good mechanisms to cope with it. You learn to understand the logic of the state and of the repression and the most effective ways to respond to that. And I'm so grateful for comrades from the revolutionary movements and underground of the 70s and 80s who provide me with advice about dealing with this, to comrades from Atlanta facing is there more extreme than mine, who provided me with a lot of advice about this. I think Atlanta needs to be a really important reference point for the repression going on in the national anti-Zionist movement, because they've been dealing with this for a while longer and have developed really effective structures to combat it. But yeah, like I said, the day after I got out of jail, I was talking to my Massachusetts lawyer at the National Day of Mourning in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And I remember him saying, what a lawyer is going to say is hide under your bed, don't say anything, and any more actions that happen at Elbit is going to hurt your case. And he said, yeah, that's what a lawyer will say. But ultimately, what you do is your political choice. And that's not going to be the same as legal advice. And I think that's such an important distinction to make, is that legal advice is not political strategy and is not a counter-repression strategy. Lawyers swear an oath to uphold the law of the enemy. And there are a few incredible, really principled lawyers in this country, but there's also a lot of self-proclaimed movement lawyers who are feeding into this counterinsurgency and really fear-mongering people. And certainly I let myself get fear-mongered at points, and I wish I was louder at different points about my case. But since all of this repression has been going down in recent weeks in the Palestine movement, I feel like I've been in a place, having already thought about this for a year, where I can provide useful grounding advice to people. And yeah, I think another major misinterpretation that you kind of started to get to is the idea that we were asking everyone in the movement to do what we did or what we were doing, which was never the case, obviously. I mean, it's completely unrealistic to expect everyone in the movement to put their bodies on the line in that way, or to decide that their role is building the underground or doing militant actions. There are many different roles and many different forms of organization that are needed. And I think that mass organizing and direct action and clandestine militancy should not be in contradiction to each other. Those should all feed off each other, have this synergetic, symbiotic relationship. And we certainly see that in Atlanta with how the Above Ground has come out and defended militants. I'll never forget the video of Mary Hook saying that she won't condemn arson and that Atlanta's lucky, this country is lucky that they haven't gotten more, and that even if she can't take that risk, she sits at home and flicks her lighter. That's incredible. And that should be happening in many cities around the country wherever people are facing repression. I think we saw a similar dynamic in Cambridge too, where this mass organizing really complemented the direct actions that were happening and didn't undermine them or try to co-opt them. And I will say, like, we've really relentlessly self-critiqued about the mistakes that we made. Someone needed to try Pal Action UK tactics here and learn the lessons of whether it works or not. And we did, and we could have done things a lot smarter and a lot better for sure. But I think there needs to be way more of a culture of self-critique in the movement in general, since clearly we haven't succeeded at stopping the genocide. And we need to assess our tactics and what is working and what hasn't worked and what we need to do better. And that needs to come from all sectors of the movement. Like, I feel like we've self-critiqued a lot and divulged a lot of useful information to the movement and lessons to learn, but people who've been leading like toothless mass rallies for a year haven't necessarily been engaging in the same self-critique of like how those tactics aren't being effective.
I appreciate that. It always brings to mind one of my friend Brooke. He's an organizer with Oakland Abolition and Solidarity, and they, we've talked before about this kind of idea of an organizational smell test. And one of the important, and I hope I do justice to this as best I can in this, thinking of it off the top of my head, but one of the important principles that he sees as like key to assessing an organization is, do they actually acknowledge mistakes? Do they actually acknowledge, shortcomings, right? Do they acknowledge things that they're going to focus on and improve, right? And, it's basically like, is there a publicly available element of self-reflection and criticism that includes being critical, right? Like of, the failures or the shortcomings, right? Even if you don't totally view them as failures, right? Because you're like, maybe you see reasons why you haven't been able to achieve certain things. Like, where is the assessment, right, of what has been going on within your organization in the past, in some kind of publicly available means, and it doesn't mean you're going to reveal everything, right? Like, you don't have to. There can be certain critiques and stuff that you're going to keep internal because, you don't think that they're all for public consumption. Like, that's fine. But at some point, I don't know how, how do you become a learning organization if you don't do those things, and how do you demonstrate to other people that you're actually serious and committed to the causes that you say you are, if you're not having some public-facing form of, acknowledgments of, why you think you haven't achieved what you set out to achieve, and what are you going to do differently, or, what do you think people should learn from those shortcomings, or what do you want to learn from those shortcomings, right? So, I think that's a really important point. And so I do want to backtrack for a minute, because you did mention, and I think this is important to talk about a little bit, you did mention this access to a lot of resources. You also mentioned a lack of infrastructure, right? One point that was made on our show, and so I feel a point to bring it up, is like that in the launch of Palestine Action, one of the things that was said was like that the legal resources to defend the actions of Palestine Action would be totally provided. And I guess part of the question I have around that is, you referenced that all of you had at some point public defenders, and one of the defendants of what became the Merrimack 4 eventually had to represent herself in court for a brief period of time. Now, I'm assuming eventually you got lawyers and those were probably funded in some way, but I guess that speaks in some ways to the lack of infrastructure, because I wouldn't think that any of you should have ever had to go into court with a public defender, or that you should have ever had to represent yourself, for repression that, we'll just say, the founders of Palestine Action would have known was going to be a part of this process. And that was spoken to even in the launching of Palestine Action, that, an acknowledgement that there would be repression.
Yeah, certainly this is the question on everyone's mind. I think, just to address the last point you made, we only had public defenders for our arraignments, and that was fine. We couldn't have retained private lawyers that quickly. And then Fergie did fund our legal defense fund, and we have paid for our New Hampshire lawyers through that fund, which also can cover like travel to court, etc., which was helpful. And my Massachusetts lawyer is like a movement lawyer who's pro bono. He's incredible. He's very deep in the pro-Palestine movement. And there aren't many movement lawyers really at all in New Hampshire. So we just got like normie lawyers. And then there was also like an NLG movement lawyer on our team representing some of our other co-defendants. I will say, though, I think a mistake we made and a big critique I have is how we kind of tried to do this like above ground, underground thing at the same time and tried to transcend the two, meaning being very public and loud about what we were doing. And I mean, Fergie publicly declaring he was using all his money to overthrow the US government. I don't think it's effective to be public facing and to do clandestine action at the same time. I think we need public figures in the movement and we need like public platforms to communicate. And it's useful to have real people and real faces tied to those who are taking risk and doing these actions. But I mean, this is a critique I have of like my whole life or my whole political life is I like made a social media account when I was 14 tied to my real name and my real face that I never thought would become what it became or that my political trajectory would go where it would go. And if I were going back, I would never dox myself in that way. I would never like have my legal name attached to all the political work that I'm doing. And I think that gets to like these problems of liberal individualism in the movement where activism becomes something that people want to brand ourselves with and like have our individual social media accounts where we flex everything we're doing. When really, if we're talking about building like a long-term struggle that can withstand state repression and build capacity to cripple the state and their capacity for violence, that means killing our individualism. That means having people who are anonymous and who are not known to the state. And obviously, I'm not that anymore. I think we tried to base our model at first off what Pal Action UK was doing. And ultimately, there's just a very different legal system there. We attempted what they were doing in terms of like public recruitment, sign-up forms to vet people to do direct action, hosting Zoom trainings about Pal Action. And that's just really not like legally protective here. And increasingly, it's not in the UK either, where repression has really, really been escalating. Same goes for the intentional arrest tactic. Like in the UK, property laws are less extreme and like freedom of speech laws or lack of freedom of speech laws are more extreme. Like you can't hold a sign that says, I like Hamas, or you could get arrested, but you can like cause millions of dollars of damage to a weapons company and the police might just stand there and you might defeat your charges. And they've set really useful legal precedent there with this necessity defense that we don't have in the US. So yeah, I mean, I think there's more to be said about, you know, the role of funding in doing militant revolutionary action. I think my main takeaways from this entire experience is that the revolution's not going to be funded, especially not by a member of the ruling class, especially not in this like top-down disbursement of funds through grants to NGOs largely. I think the movement needs to create its own mechanisms to fund itself. And I think it's better to take revolutionary action with much less money than it is to take revolutionary action with money that is compromising you or putting you at further legal risk. Yeah, and certainly like the RICO cases in Atlanta are very dangerous and represent a new type of lawfare where they're targeting people for being part of a criminal organization together that isn't an organization at all. Most of the people in the RICO indictment have never met each other before, yet they're all being charged with like conspiracy using evidence as weak as like they had mud on their shoes or they handed out a flyer. And I think there's been a lot of fears of this same like RICO, use of RICO being expanded to other states or federally. And certainly that's a possibility. And certainly I think Georgia is like at the forefront of fascism in this country and of repression, but their case is also falling apart. I mean, if you read the indictment, it's typo riddled and completely incompetent. And like there's been Stop Cop City defendants who've been about to go to trial and then their charges get dropped. And some of the RICO defendants, like the Atlanta Solidarity Fund people, had some of their charges dropped, not all of them, but like the money laundering charges. So I do think that's another example of how the extreme charges were meant to have a chilling effect on the movement to stop direct action, which clearly it didn't do because direct action arsons have continued in Atlanta since all these arrests and since additional raids. So I guess I'm not particularly worried about that right now, like widely expanding. But I think it's really important for people in the movement who are taking revolutionary action to study all these ongoing and historical counterinsurgencies, whether it's the RICO cases in Atlanta, whether it's the Green Scare, whether it's like Casey Goonan's charges, whether it's the Holy Land Five, whether it's COINTELPRO, and a lot of the counterterrorism legislation in this country, which was almost all specifically developed to target Palestinians. And I guess I also want to use this time to like shout out people who are getting repressed that aren't getting enough attention. And like I said earlier, I think it's really important to support people who are facing extreme charges and being repressed, even if we disagree with some of their politics or tactics, because ultimately letting their repression win or failing to be in solidarity with those people is going to make it easier for the state to use that lawfare against all of us. So, I mean, shout out to Casey Goonan. They've been in jail or prison, maybe, I think jail since June for alleged arsons in the Bay Area. And their charges were dropped by the state and taken over by the feds. So I think they're facing like up to 20 years in prison for escalating during the student encampments, allegedly. I want to shout out like that people in Pennsylvania, there were some animal liberation activists who were arrested and have been held on $150,000 bail and facing some really insane charges, including like eco-terrorism and cruelty to animals. And like, obviously, I personally am not upholding like animal liberation as one of the main tactics I think people should be uptaking right now in the US. I think we should be targeting like weapons companies and imperialist infrastructure. But I'm definitely going to defend these people who took a principled action and are now being really heavily repressed. Same goes for like people in Pittsburgh who were raided and had phones seized and are now facing federal charges for spray painting Jews for Palestine on a Jewish religious building. Like, I think in general, it's good practice to not target religious buildings. And I think like the Palestinian resistance has their own principles and policy about never doing that. But that's crazy to charge people with this for spray painting Jews for Palestine. And same goes for our political prisoners who've been locked up for decades. I mean, Leonard Peltier was just hospitalized. Mumia is still locked up. The political prisoners movement in this country, I feel like is not as strong as it has been in the past and as it could be. And instead of these individual prisoner release campaigns, we need to build a like much broader collective political prisoners movement inspired by groups like Samidun who've been doing that for Palestinians. And I mean, I don't like refer to myself as a political prisoner. I'm not going to prison. I'm going to jail for a very short amount of time. But I do feel like my experience with this helps me realize how important it is to be, centering political prisoners in all of our struggle, and to remember that if we're serious about winning, if we're understanding this struggle for what it is, people are going to go to jail, people are going to go to prison, people are going to die, and people are going to fight, and people are going to win. If we're serious about winning, we have to know all those things are going to happen. And if that's not what people signed up for because they just want to be like a pundit or like a grad student, then that's fine, but they shouldn't get in the way of the people who are trying to like build a real militant movement that has the capacity to win.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you responded well to what I was going to ask about Atlanta too. I mean, there's something about one of the things in my mind that I've been trying to wrestle with, right, is that, the anarchist tradition or the autonomous tradition more, right, has this belief in the value of autonomous action, the importance of people to be able to decide these things and take actions themselves, et cetera. And I think that there's some interesting elements of that, because obviously if no one's directing people to do certain things, right, then in theory, you can't charge, or at least you can't prove. I guess maybe that's more where it becomes important, is you can't prove that if I didn't direct someone to do something, right, that we're in some sort of conspiracy together, right? But it's interesting the way that like something like RICO, right, is being weaponized with regard to the Stop Cop City thing. You kind of saw seeds of this in the way that the right responded to Antifa, right, during the Trump administration, sort of suggesting that it's some mass organization funded by Soros or whatever, everything's always funded by Soros to these people. then there's also, and you mentioned it with regard to Palestine. I mean, there are these policy papers that are out there right now, Heritage Foundation, other foundations, where they are, basically looking at every organization that has some sort of connection to Palestine. And, basically they're trying to draw them in all to this connection to terrorism, right? And it's all very... It's interesting because it in some way, like you talked about the distinction between the UK and the US around speech, but really what these people are often using that are presenting these policies is this attempt to say, because these groups have expressed solidarity with Palestinians, including solidarity with resistance groups, expressed it, right? So they're talking about speech. And because they're like all working together, that this is some sort of basically, Iran-backed or Hamas-backed or Hamas support conspiracy, right? And, I don't know. It's like one of those things. It's like, again, like just them floating this out, right, creates another form of sort of chilling effect to talk about that. There's a psychological impact of them circulating these policy papers that suggest that this is what they're going to try to do. Obviously, legally, it's very dubious, but we also know that the law is not the ultimate, it's not some magical thing, right, that just decides like, oh, this is legal, this is illegal. And so I guess to form it towards a question, I wonder about these questions, I guess, of infrastructure, right? And whether, in your view, how much you think something like autonomy serves, and maybe some of the problems that you see with autonomy, if you do see some, as well as like the benefits of it, right? Because there are real benefits too. And like, yeah, so I don't know. If you want to respond to that, feel free. If not, we can move on to something else, because I realize this is just something I'm thinking about as you're talking.
Yeah, this is something I've thought so much about in the past year. I think I used to be one of those communists who was very like dismissive of anarchists, when in reality we have so much to learn from them. I think there's a very like morally superior, like anarchists smell bad and don't shower thing coming from communists that like I don't actually hear from a lot of anarchists about communists. And frankly, I'd rather be in struggle with a militant anarchist who's gonna throw down and be on my side of the barricades than a communist who's wearing a yellow peace police vest and is gonna turn me over to the cops, or a communist who just wants to like read books for 30 years before they're ready to do anything. I think like a lot of the anarchists' critiques of like what's happening in the Palestine movement in regards to escalation, like get there and get close to it, but don't necessarily fully get there. Like, I don't think the existence of leadership and organization is the problem. I think bad, opportunist, liberal leadership and organization is the problem. Certainly organization is still like totally necessary. I think we need to build new forms of organization. I don't think like the early 20th century bureaucratic vanguard party model can be copy-pasted into the context of the settler colonial US. I think the state of counterinsurgency here also necessitates degrees of decentralization and autonomy, and that's not like unique or new. I mean, like if you study past guerrilla movements in the Imperial Corps, like for example, the Red Army faction, like that was completely part of their organization, was like balancing centralization and decentralization and the autonomy of their, individual units or cells. I think the same goes for the relationship between spontaneity and organization. I think some anarchists maybe put too much of an emphasis on the power of spontaneity and the spontaneous militancy of the masses, when like the spontaneous militancy of the masses is real and should be, used as much to our advantage as possible. In, building a revolution. Like, look at the George Floyd uprising. 25 million people were in the streets burning and looting in most major cities. And like hundreds, thousands of cops were calling out of work sick because they were scared. But ultimately, the lack of organization in that moment led to the easy and neutralization of the uprising. And I think you can see similar examples in student encampments where some like occupations and escalations were very spontaneous and as a result like disorganized, Whereas others, like, for example, Hinds Hall, that was a very surgically planned and coordinated operation where they took the time to do line struggle and win over the support of most of the people in the camp so that it was very, successful, and also like had great operational security, where the prosecutors have admitted they couldn't really prosecute anyone because everyone was blocked up and they covered all the security cameras, so they literally couldn't identify who was doing anything. But yeah, I think a lot of these like questions you're raising, which could be framed through like the difference between anarchist and communist tactics, are things I've been thinking about in the aftermath of Palestine Action US. Like, ultimately, anarchists are a lot of the people in major cities that are like, know about these tactics, know about digital security, are the ones on the front lines, like fighting against the cops and like largely getting away with it and defeating repression. Yeah, I think the last thing to add about some tendencies I see in anarchists in this country is a rejection of the leadership of the axis of resistance, because many of the leading members of the axis of resistance, and I mean, Iran, whose General Qasem Soleimani constructed the axis of resistance, hold state power. And I think ultimately that's the historical phase that we're in right now. I'm not some like hardcore statist, but I think the historical phase that we're in right now is that there are nation states. And I mean, I believe in the like Leninist concept of the eventual withering away of the state, probably at a very higher stage of communism that won't be in my lifetime. But I think it's so important to uphold the members of the axis of resistance with all their contradictions. There's tendencies from people in the West to just like fetishize or uphold only the PFLP, when what the PFLP is doing on the ground is uniting in the unity of the fields with all the other Palestinian resistance factions, despite all their ideological differences. I think even these groups that don't explicitly identify as communist are doing far more to make communism possible by, striking blows at the empire. And that's why it's so important that we like understand and uphold Hamas and Ansar Allah and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and recognizing all those contradictions. But frankly, they're not really our business as people in the West whose governments are committing genocide against them. And so I do think it's really, really important to learn from them. And I think like this gets to the concepts, the Palestinian resistance concept of the unity of the fields, where we unite in our immediate objectives to achieve, our revolutionary goals, despite our ideological differences, despite our geographic distance or whatever that is. Che also has an incredible line in his piece, Notes on the Study of the Ideology of the Cuban Revolution, where he talks about this and how many different tendencies unite for the immediate objectives of the revolution. And the new revolutionary theory and structure like emerges through putting that into practice. And that's how I look at, the phase we're in right now, and uniting with anarchists, for example, in the US, where we're in a phase of national liberation struggles. We're trying to like dismantle and destroy the US and to liberate the internal colonies, rather than just trying to like build socialism in America. What does it mean to build socialism in America? When people say that, I think of like the Nordic model and giving us better healthcare on the super profits of the global South, rather than like dismantling the settler colony. So to get to some of the other like lessons that I think also get to your question, I mean, I think intentional arrest is still fundamentally like a pacifist tactic, regardless of how militant your action is. If it ends in the goal of it ending is you like sitting there and letting the police arrest you, I think that is pacifist. I think Ward Churchill's book, Pacifism as Pathology, really gets at that. And like, if we're serious about building a long-term protracted struggle that can withstand state repression, we can't hand over people to the state. I think there's also limitations of what we were doing in solely targeting Elbit. That made a lot of sense in the UK, where it's very population dense and where there were Elbits in almost every major city that could be targeted. And then after they targeted all the Elbits, they were expanding to their investors, their insurers, to other weapons companies. But that wasn't really the case in the US. Like, a lot of the Elbits are in locations that aren't strategic to target it, like Talladega, Alabama is not a great place to get arrested for direct action. And they strategically place a lot of these weapons companies in like rural conservative communities where weapons companies and the military industrial complex is like the economic lifeline of those communities. And that was another critique of like PAL action in general, but our New Hampshire action was that we got critiques for like alienating the masses or scaring people away from supporting Palestine, which our action was not to appeal to the New Hampshire masses, to be clear. Our action was for Palestine. Our action was for the people in Gaza who like write posters thanking PAL action for dismantling weapons companies. And I've heard this critique from a lot of like major groups in the movement, honestly, who I think ignore the question of the labor aristocracy. I'm very naive to think that we can just organize weapons company workers, which is based on the assumption they have any consciousness or any conscience left to begin with. And frankly, we don't have time to like wait and organize these workers to defy their own material interests. I think we should be escalating and dismantling these supply chains of weapons. And actually, it's led a lot of people to quit their jobs too. Like we found out that after our action in New Hampshire, several people from that facility quit their job, which obviously isn't as big a win as like shutting the whole facility down, but certainly like I think it's had an effect. And I guess to give an example of what I think are really smart, clever tactics, I just saw this on social media yesterday, but there was an action in Ottawa, Canada, sabotaging gas stops. I think that's how it's pronounced. And it's a factory that's the only factory in the world where engine sensors are produced for Lockheed Martin's F-35 jets, which are being used to bomb Gaza to dust. And like that, I think is a really smart action. One, because they're targeting a facility that's like a key bottleneck in the supply chain, where if they lost their ability to make those parts, that could throw off the entire production of these jets. I think researching and finding those sort of facilities, of which there are many, you know, there's certain facilities where it's like the only facility that make a certain type of screw that's like an essential part for a certain kind of weapon. I think that's a really strategic target, because we always had a lot of people messaging us being like, there's no Elbit near me. Why can't I target this? Why can't I target that? And it was hard to direct people. Like virtually every corporation, every entity in the US is like complicit in some way with imperialism and with Zionism. If we're just targeting all of them at random, that's not going to go anywhere. But also if we limit our focus too narrowly, it's going to like not allow people to really be involved. So actually figuring out like, what are we targeting? What is important to target, I think is really key. And yeah, I think that action in Ottawa was also clever because they caused a lot of property damage based on the communique that they anonymously released, but it was clandestine. They got away with no arrest, and they said in their communique they're going to keep coming back and they're going to keep dismantling weapons companies until they divest from Lockheed Martin. So like I said earlier, like the point of our action was not saying this is the one type of action that's correct and everyone should be doing. Like it was an attempt at a tactic, and lessons were learned from that attempt. And I look at all these like thrusts at militancy in the same way. Like we need to accumulate all this experience and figure out the most effective tactics and combination of tactics. It's just two more things to add. You know, we need to look at what our enemy is doing to figure out what our strategy is. What the enemy is doing since 2020 especially is preparing for urban guerrilla warfare, and they're building cop cities everywhere to train and militarize cops and all first responders to prepare for that. And in terms of the Stop Cop City cases, only one single person there has been charged for any clandestine action. So this idea that like clandestine direct action and property damage is more dangerous than all other tactics is actually not necessarily true at all. And the efficacy of the actions in Atlanta, the like impossibility for the state to really identify people who are doing the biggest acts of property damage is why they cast this huge net with the RICO case, is because they couldn't figure out who was really doing things. And ultimately, I think like my biggest lesson from the past year is that we need to talk about our orientation to the police and understand the police as an occupying force of the internal colonies or peripheries in the so-called United States. And that gets to like the limitations of calling this the Palestine Solidarity Movement or diluting what Palestine put on the table as like a single issue movement to begin with. I really like how Max Eil said that Palestine is a crystallization of all the world's contradictions, because it is. And if we understand like the US as inseparable from, you know, the Zionist entity, and as our struggle against them as one and the same, which is the line of all the Palestinian resistance groups, you know, they understand the US is the primary enemy and the Zionist entity as its mere proxy, then we have to get serious about dismantling the US empire, and that will happen through opening as many fronts as possible and broadening this to be a real revolutionary anti-imperialist movement.
Yeah. As you were talking, it reminded me a lot of Ed Mead, Rest in Power. And I've reflected a lot that since October 7th, I wished that he was still with us so that I could interview him. But there's a thing that he talked about. I mean, one, he has a great critique of the tamed left. But there's also, well, let me see if I can find a quote from him on the tamed left too. It says, others like the dogmatist and mechanical Marxist-Leninists see the need for revolutionary violence at some future date, but believe it will emerge with the development of the mass movement just prior to the actual insurrection by the working class. They do not see and therefore cannot appreciate the need for a hidden infrastructure capable of exercising selective forms of armed work. For them, it is either full insurrection or nothing. The possibility that they may have to go underground at some point is a thought beyond their comprehension. That's how deeply these revolutionaries, he uses air quotes around that, are locked into bourgeois legality. In fact, like the ruling class, they see all forms of armed struggle as quote-unquote terrorism. Yeah, so anyways, they talk about that. But then there's also this thing, and I can't find it immediately, but he talks about also essentially the need to practice. Right, that even in the idea that if a revolution isn't going to happen until a future date, right, if you recognize that a revolutionary activity necessitates some form of force, that you have to learn how to do those things, you know? And so in his thought, always like one, a clear necessity. I mean, he was responding to actual forms of repression, and not just him, the George Jackson Brigade, right? But they were responding to actual forms of repression. They were organizing, they were doing different things, and they were always a smaller group. It's not like this was a huge movement. But they believed that armed action was, you know, there's the propaganda, the deed sort of element of it. But there's also this, like, you know, you're not going to learn how to do these things or get better or become effective at them if you don't have experience with trying them either. And that always seemed to me to be such a logical and important point. And it's also interesting, you know, because he critiques these, what he calls these dogmatist Marxist-Leninist groups for this. But what's fascinating to me, too, is you referenced it earlier, like, you know, there's a long history of communist and Marxist-Leninist organizations that had underground, clandestine, you know, official members, and then people who were kind of off the books and all of these things. And so the idea that these things, that they can't have some form of coexistence, some form of dual organization, I mean, one, I think it's ahistorical, but I also think that if we actually are studying and learning from revolutionary history, then it's important to look at that history and see that, you know, these organizations that were serious, and when at the times when they were, you know, really, you know, and maybe you have an assessment of like, hey, we don't have enough people to do that right now. I don't know. I mean, to be generous to people. But the point being, obviously, as a genocide is going on, right, and as there is an armed struggle, and as you're trying to figure out how do I support this righteous cause, that these are moments in which people, one, like you said, have a duty, as you mentioned earlier, and that's something I always appreciated, you know, Huda talking about as well from Palestine Action UK. But also, especially if you're going to do it, and this gets also to the question of whether you should plan to be arrested. I mean, I think that probably is something that we should not do. You know, but I do think that the point of actually engaging in direct action and trying to do these tactics, you know, that makes a lot of sense, you know, and for a number of reasons. So, yeah, I don't know if you have any response to that, but, you know, I miss Ed for that, and I appreciate that in his work.
I love the quote that you read. I really want to read his book. I doubt they'll let me get it in jail, but hopefully once I'm out, I'll be able to read that. It reminded me a lot of a quote from James Yawkey Sales, who was, a Black Panther, and he wrote a great, great pamphlet on state repression that I think really needs to be updated for the 21st century regarding digital security, which is this whole new dimension. And like our phones are arguably the greatest tool our enemy has against us with the constant surveillance it provides them. But he said, anti-imperialist revolution will never be legal in this country. And any revolutionary struggle, if it's not illegal yet, it will become illegal, and it's too serious to be kept in the glass house. So I completely agree with you. I feel like some people interpret calls for escalation as like calls to start guerrilla warfare like tomorrow, which really isn't the case. Like, obviously, our movement isn't prepared for that. I mean, I don't even know how to drive a car. Like, we clearly have a lot of tactical skills, security skills to build up. And I think really to like advance in tactics, there is often this like fetishization of tactics when really our politics should inform our tactics. We need to put politics in command. And for me, like the understanding of the US and its like base as a settler state, as a settler empire, and understanding like the class dimensions of the different populations in the US, like that informs why I think this tactic is necessary. And I think the history of struggle in the US shows that. But yeah, I think like the Bolsheviks are also a great example of that. There's a lot of vulgarization of Lenin's like left-wing communism and infantile disorder as a justification from electoralists, whether they are third-party candidates or supporting Kamala. They use that to justify voting in elections and reinforcing the legitimacy of the US government. And I mean, I think the only line should be boycott the elections or write in someone from the resistance. But like a lot of that vulgarization of Lenin ignores that the Bolsheviks like always had an underground apparatus that their organizing and the distribution of their materials was criminalized from the beginning. And so even when they were doing more above ground work and running candidates in their Duma, like, which also has a very different character than the US Congress, they always had this underground, and they were always like pushing towards more militancy and understanding, the ultimate goal would be revolution and would be an overtaking of the state power. I mean, the last person I'll mention who I think has really influenced my thinking on this is Grace Lee Boggs. I think her piece, Organization Means Commitment, is an essential reading for anyone organizing in the Imperial Core, especially the US, because we can't just like copy paste, models from the global South into the core, or even from other core countries that aren't settler colonial to the US context. It's very unique. And she talks a lot about how this will be one of the first revolutions in history where, because we're so economically overdeveloped, but humanistically underdeveloped, that people here are going to have to start getting used to having less. And she makes a lot of critiques of like the revolutionary movements in the 70s and 80s and young people jumping from organization to organization, doing militancy just to do militancy. My main takeaway from that piece is how she talks about how it's far more effective to organize with a few people who are very closely aligned with you, who you can really like synthesize your political lines with and start studying and creating propaganda and building up your skills and taking actions together. That's far more effective than it is to organize with 100 people who are completely unaligned politically, which will never get anywhere. And I found myself in that trajectory. Like, I was in DSA, I left in 2021. I was in CPUSA, I left a year or two ago. Like, I really do think we need to like create new forms of organization. And a lot of the like self-proclaimed socialist vanguard parties in the US are not fulfilling that role and are instead channeling people's energy into like the passive act of voting, which is counterinsurgency.
Appreciated. Let's talk a little bit more about counterinsurgency and repression, because you talked about some of the impacts of it, as well as some of the things that, you think should be done differently in this way. So yeah, what are some of the things you think from your own experience in terms of counteracting, the impacts of repression? You talk about the kind of psychological toll a little bit and the isolation of it. How do you think we better counteract that? I know you've offered some thoughts, but if you have more. And then counterinsurgency, like, how do you see that maybe within the left, and how do we avoid within the left replicating forms of counterinsurgency?
Yeah, I think There's two answers to your first question, because there's the answers of if you are the individual or one of the individuals facing repression, what do you do? And then the broader movement, what should the broader movement do to counteract repression? I think those are different answers. I guess I'll answer first, like, if you're an individual facing repression, like I said earlier, never let it crush your spirit, arm the spirit, form a support group. That's really key. I had support groups that I made immediately to like advise me on personal advice, on political advice, on legal advice, to hear opinions from people who weren't my lawyers. There's a lot of resources written by revolutionaries who've been through this that are available to learn and make you feel less alone. The Tilted Guide to Being a Defendant, anyone who's facing charges, no matter how severe they are, should totally read that book. There's a great pamphlet called How to Survive a Felony Trial that, funnily enough, I like picked up and read like a week before I was arrested, having no idea I'd get felonies, and actually was really, really helpful and grounding for me. And talking to people who've been through this and survived it and spent decades in prison, I think for me, already like being connected to some of those people was really empowering. Like during my whole case, I haven't stopped thinking about the Cuban Five, who I've had the chance to meet in Cuba. Like my comrade Gerardo, he was facing 2 life sentences in 13 years for supposedly being a Cuban spy in the US. And he was released in 2014, and he's in Cuba, a leader of the revolution with his children. So I think like, yeah, keeping up hope, and even if the charges don't get dropped, keeping up hope, even if you do have to go to prison, keeping up hope is really important, especially not self-marginalizing or self-isolating from the movement. I think a big state tactic when they're targeting revolutionaries is trying to network map and trying to pinpoint who everyone is associated with, who everyone is organizing with, and trying to take down those networks. So actually the best way to counteract that is to associate with and organize with as many people as possible. For me, when I was certainly isolated for a few months and I didn't really go to any political events at all, but it felt so good once I started doing that. I was really scared at first. It was very anxiety inducing to like be in spaces where I was so anxious about my charges or other people being scared to interact with me because of my charges. But I think it was really positive for our case that we stayed deeply involved in the movement and interacting with people and continuing to contribute in new ways, even if we couldn't be on the ground taking action anymore. For example, producing propaganda is really important. In terms of how the movement should respond, I think that, like I said, the point of the repression is to like divide the movement into groups of good protesters and bad protesters. They think Pal Action are bad protesters. They think Samidoun are bad protesters. They think Behind Enemy Lines, who escalated at the Chicago DNC, are bad protesters, as well as like some other groups. And then they're trying to put, more like NGOs or people who do like peaceful rallies into this box of good protesters. And those people and those different groups can take up different tactics, but what's important is that all those groups like defend each other when they face repression, and it goes both ways. And I heard a lot of fear-mongering after the Samidoun designation, where people were basically like, we all need to be silent. Anyone who says anything will be charged with MST. And I was like, no, that's exactly what the state wants you to say. Actually, if every single organization spoke out and said, we defend Samidoun, it's impossible for them to target us all or take us all out. It truly is. And so the louder we are in the face of repression, the bigger defense we have. Samidoun was especially targeted because they have never backed down from explicitly supporting Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the PFLP and Iran and Ansar Allah and Hezbollah and all the resistance groups. And I think another response to that in the movement was like, oh, now we need to self-censor. Soon speech simply saying we support these groups will be criminalized as MST, which just like, sure, that could happen down the line, and we should be prepared for the state to attempt to criminalize all of us, but that's not the phase we're at right now. And even if it were, the response would not be to silence and self-censor ourselves. It would be to defend the resistance more loudly than ever and to make it impossible for them to target and divide and isolate us and pick us off. So yeah, I think like counter-repression needs to be talked about in the movement. And those are just like some of the ways I think it can work. I think there's been a lot of exciting examples of like cross-movement solidarity. Like I think back to the Hinds Hall press conference when the occupiers of Hinds Hall had their first court date in June, in New York City, and it was right after Casey Goonan's arrest, and they gave a press conference for the Holy Land Five, for Casey Goonan, for the Stop Cop City defendants, for the Merrimack Four, for Leonard Peltier, for Mumia, for all political prisoners, like uniting all these struggles and using moments when we are facing repression to be in solidarity with other people facing repression is so, so, so important. Yeah, I mean, counterinsurgency. I think like understanding counterinsurgency within the movement, we see that a lot of the effects of state repression aren't even coming directly from the state itself. They're counting on people to police themselves, to repress themselves, to censor themselves, or for the self-proclaimed like good protesters or appointed good protesters to isolate militants. A really good example of this is the BDS National Committee, which I would say is one of the chief like counterinsurgent self-proclaimed pro-Palestine groups that has consistently condemned the resistance, consistently like called for all groups in the West to never vocally support the resistance. And they were really like helping tee up Samidoun to get this designation, because for years and years they were like condemning Samidoun and trying to coerce other groups not to work with them. And I'm saying that because it's all public. Right after the encampments, they put out a statement where they like put on a ton of signatures from orgs on the ground in Palestine that actually had never read this statement, which was like only in English and had not actually approved what it said. And in that statement, they made this point about how groups should never support the resistance. And they also made very racist arguments about like outside agitators, warning student encampments about outside agitators, and drawing parallels to Ferguson 2014, where there was the same very racist narrative about outside agitators used to undermine the militancy. And so I think that's like an example of how this counterinsurgency is coming from within the movement as well, particularly from NGOs. I think it's a reality that has to be recognized that a lot of people in the West have like made careers out of what they're doing and public platforms and speaking and being pundits on things. And those people are never going to want to sacrifice their own careers or material interests for the necessary escalation. And there's a lot of like public commentators and figures who I think have incredible analysis and incredible historical perspective, who I really appreciate, but we shouldn't look to those people for our political direction or tactical direction. We should look at the people on the ground who are on the front lines for that. And I think right now, largely the movement, like the self-proclaimed movement leadership, particularly NGOs, like are tailing the masses and how far they're willing to escalate. We saw that in the encampments when there was this just spontaneous explosion of encampments everywhere. And those were being led by people on the ground. And a lot of these like orgs kind of lost their like semblance of legitimacy or leadership over the movement. And yeah, I think instead like the orgs and the above ground should also be following the lines of the militants. And we see that in Atlanta for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And it's one of those things, it's like engaging in the type of media work that Josh and I do. It's always very challenging, and we have this constant kind of difficulty with it. And, you know, of that in the West, like we're so conditioned to look for ideological leadership from academics and, you know, like nonprofit leaders and, you know, leaders of organizations and parties and things like this. And, but, you know, more prominently, it's often academics or people who have made a career out of talking about radical movements, maybe even participating in them, but, you know, often participating in ones that, you know, don't require them, like you said, to kind of be on the front lines or to be engaged in like really, you know, they wouldn't be able to have a really strong conversation with you about organizing and tactics because that's not really what they're doing, right? That's not where their expertise lies. And there's like this challenge with it, engaging it even in the media space of like, most people come to watch those people. So like you can't not have, from my perspective, some relationship with these people because this is where the audience comes into your programming. But it's very difficult of like, how do you then not replicate that same problem, right? And, obviously we try to counteract it by also balancing a lot of conversations as much as we can, right, with people who are organizers, are militants, are doing direct action, etc. Often also political prisoners or people who've been politically imprisoned. But it never fails for me to notice when I look at the analytics or whatever that not as many people show up for those conversations. And so anyways, those of you who are still listening at this point, just note that. One, that you're probably one of the good ones because you've sat through this long, but also think about that within your own behavior, because it's a reality that we all have to, and I fall into it myself, right? So it's how do we need to be conscious of this problem and try to overcome it, because what you're saying is totally true. All right, last thing, because I know we gotta start to wind up. First of all, just thank you for this conversation, Calla. This has been great. Obviously, our solidarity to you, and I know that hopefully this is going to be a very brief time in jail that you spend, and then on to bigger and better things. But I just wanted to honor the risks and the sacrifices that you have made, even if they are not the ones that people are making, because obviously there's some people who have sacrificed their lives and all kinds of things, right? So we have to keep everything in perspective. But nonetheless, I think risk-taking and the willingness to do what you and other comrades that you're around have done is so important. And if I knew how to cultivate it in millions of people, that was what I would want to do, including in myself. So on that note, as we kind of wrap up, is there anything else you want to share in terms of some lessons learned? I realize you shared a number of them along the way. So maybe if there's just any others through a kind of critical or self-critical perspective as we close this up.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. It was a really great discussion, and obviously I still have to be really careful with how I talk about things and how much detail I divulge. So I hope people listening, if you feel like I'm obscuring anything or anything I've said sounds like it was phrased weirdly, know that that's why. And I hope once I'm out, I can speak even more in depth about these things. We'll be posting on social media how to write to us and send us books in jail for those of us who are comfortable with having our address be publicized. But I just want to say, don't worry about me when I'm in jail. We'll be fine. This is a tiny drop in the bucket compared to what Palestinians are sacrificing every single day. And I don't want people to worry about me. I want them to worry about themselves and what they are doing or failing to do every day that this Holocaust of Palestine continues. So yeah, thanks again for having me on. And then another aspect of the lawfare against us was that my passport was seized by arrest, and so I was banned from leaving the country. Some of my members of my were living outside the U.S. when I was arrested, and we were all supposed to go visit them for Christmas, so I requested my passport back from the state, and they refused it, and I spent Christmas alone. My whole family left, and then they added to my bail conditions that I was banned from leaving the country, and they used to justify that the fact that I frequently traveled to Cuba, and then also that I was associated with Fergie, who left for Tunisia 3 days after I got out. So I am excited once I get out to have my freedom of travel again. I miss Cuba. I miss my comrades in Cuba. A lot of my closest friends in Cuba are medical students who grew up in Gaza, whose families are all in Gaza, who are studying there. And those people have been some of my biggest support this entire experience and are constantly checking in with me and seeing how I'm doing and apologizing for how hard what I'm going through is, which really feels like it pales in comparison and is nothing compared to people whose families are stuck in a concentration camp. So yeah, I think it's important to keep all of that in perspective. And ultimately, as Mohammed Al-Kurd said in his fantastic essay, "Are we indeed all Palestinians?" If we are saying that, we should be joining Palestinians in resisting and in sacrificing instead of, just saying that as a slogan and living our daily lives as usual. I wish I wasn't going to jail. I don't think it's particularly useful to the movement that I'm going to jail, but I don't think I could live with myself right now or at any point after October 7th if I hadn't put my own body on the line and if I hadn't taken risk while I was getting voice memos of my friends being bombed every day. So yeah, I think a lot of the rejection of militancy and escalation in the US relies on the assumption that people in the global South should be the ones doing most of the dying. And I reject that. That's all.
No, I appreciate it, and I reject it as well. And yeah. Anyway, I thank you so much, Calla. This has been, a really rich conversation, and I appreciate all of your reflections and thoughts. And again, our solidarity to you and to others who are engaging in things that need to be done. Right? We need to be the importance. As you said, you're not calling for some, ridiculous escalation beyond what is possible right now, but the importance of understanding that these weapons are made in our backyards and are being sent over there, and that we are strategically the people who are positioned to respond to that, right? And, if we're actually in solidarity, then I think we need to take that very seriously. So anyway, I definitely appreciate you, and thank you.
Yeah, this was a great conversation.
Bye.